There's a story that goes around the internet, and it goes like this. In the 1800s, there was a medical treatment called the rest cure. And if you were quiet, if you avoided eye contact, hated parties, preferred a book to a ballroom, doctors had a cure for you. A treatment so brutal it supposedly killed thousands of introverts, locked away and tortured for the crime of being shy. It's a chilling story. It racks up millions of views. And I have to be honest with you right at the top, it's not quite true. But here's the thing, and this is why you should keep watching. The real history is worse. Not because it killed introverts. It didn't. Introversion wasn't even a concept doctors recognized. The real history is worse because of who it actually targeted. Why and how a treatment marketed as gentle, restful, and healing managed to break people so completely that some of them never recovered, and a few of them ended up in asylums or dead. So let's do something the viral version never does. Let's separate the myth from the truth, because the truth is a far better story. The myth says they killed introverts. The truth says they had a diagnosis called hysteria, another called neurasthenia, and these labels got slapped on enormous numbers of people, overwhelmingly women, who were anxious, exhausted, depressed, or simply inconvenient. And the flagship cure for these conditions was one of the most quietly cruel treatments in medical history. It was called the rest cure. And on paper, it sounds like a spa vacation. You'd lie in bed. You'd be fed rich food, milk and cream and red meat until you gained weight. You'd get massages. You'd rest. For weeks. What could possibly be harmful about rest? Everything, as it turns out. Because the rest cure wasn't really rest. It was enforced isolation and total sensory shutdown, dressed up in the language of care. No reading, no writing, no conversation, no visitors. Sometimes not even the ability to feed yourself or roll over without permission. For weeks on end. And, for a certain kind of patient, it didn't heal anything. It was closer to being buried alive with your own thoughts. One woman who survived it wrote a story about the experience that's now studied in classrooms all over the world, because it was, essentially, a horror story, and it was based on what a real doctor really did to her. So no, they didn't kill introverts. What they did was stranger, sadder, and far more revealing about how the 19th century treated the human mind. Let's get into it. Starting with the two diagnoses at the center of all of this. To understand the treatment, you have to understand the two labels that led people to it. Because in the 19th century, if you were struggling mentally in almost any way, you were likely to be handed one of two diagnoses. And both of them were less like precise medical conditions and more like enormous nets that caught whoever fell into them. The first was hysteria. Now, this word has a long and genuinely awful history. It comes from the Greek word for uterus, which tells you everything about who it was aimed at. For centuries, hysteria was the catch-all explanation for basically any behavior in a woman that a male doctor found difficult, confusing, or inconvenient. Anxiety, hysteria. Depression, hysteria, anger, frustration, grief. A woman who was too emotional or not emotional enough, or too independent or too tired or unhappy in her marriage. Hysteria. It was a diagnosis that could mean almost anything, which in practice meant it often meant nothing at all, except this woman is not behaving the way we want her to. By the latter half of the century, hysteria had attracted serious academic attention in Europe as well. The French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot was staging elaborate demonstrations of hysterical patients at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, turning the diagnosis into a spectacle studied by doctors across the Western world, including a young Sigmund Freud, who attended Charcot's lectures in 1885, and whose later work on the unconscious grew partly from that encounter with hysteria. So what American doctors were doing with the rest cure wasn't happening in isolation. It was part of a transatlantic medical conversation about women, nerves, and the boundaries of the mind. The second label was neurasthenia. This one was newer, coined by the American neurologist George Beard in 1869, and it literally meant weakness of the nerves. Beard's theory was that modern life, the speed, the noise, the pressure of a rapidly industrializing world, was draining people's finite supply of nervous energy, leaving them exhausted, anxious, and unable to cope. Symptoms included fatigue, insomnia, irritability, dread, indigestion, and a general sense of being overwhelmed. And here's a detail that matters enormously, because it's where the introvert myth quietly falls apart. Neurasthenia wasn't reserved for the shy or the withdrawn. It was diagnosed in men and women, in the anxious and the ambitious alike. In fact, among the middle and upper classes, it became almost fashionable, a sign that you were sensitive and refined, too civilized for the brutal modern world. Writers had it, intellectuals had it. It was a badge, not a stigma, if you had money. So already you can see the problem with the viral version. There was no diagnosis for introverts. There was a pair of vague, sprawling labels that got applied to a staggering range of human distress, and, crucially, applied very differently depending on whether you were a man or a woman, rich or poor. Because that's the other thing these diagnoses did. They didn't fall evenly. The overwhelming majority of patients funneled toward the harsher treatments were women, and specifically educated women. Doctors of the era genuinely theorized that too much education, too much intellectual activity, too much ambition was causing nervous illness in women by diverting energy away from where they believed it belonged. Domestic life, motherhood, obedience. Read that again, because it's the key to this whole story. The illness being treated was, in a lot of cases, a woman wanting more than the narrow life she'd been assigned. And the cure was designed, whether the doctors admitted it or not, to send her back to it. Which brings us to the man who designed that cure, and the deceptively simple treatment that made him famous. His name was Silas Weir Mitchell, and in the late 1800s, he was one of the most respected nerve doctors in the world. A Civil War veteran physician, a published author, a man whose reputation drew wealthy patients from across America and Europe. In 1877, he laid out his method in a book called Fat and Blood, a title that sounds alarming and was, in some ways, a fair preview of the philosophy inside it. And the treatment he built made him a legend. It was called the Rest Cure, and it spread from the United States across Britain and became the go-to prescription for nervous illness for decades. Here's how it worked. First, they removed you from your life entirely. You were isolated, cut off from family, friends, and any familiar face. Mitchell believed that the people around a nervous patient, especially the family, were part of the problem. So the cure began by severing every social tie. You were placed under the care of nurses and a doctor, and often nobody else. Then came the rest. And I mean total, enforced rest. You were confined to bed for weeks, commonly 6 to 8, sometimes longer. And it was not lounging in bed with a good book rest. You were forbidden to read. forbidden to write, forbidden to sew, to paint, to do any creative or intellectual activity whatsoever. Conversation was restricted or banned outright. In the strictest versions, you weren't even permitted to feed yourself or roll over or get up to use the bathroom without a nurse's help. The goal was to reduce you to near total passivity, a body in a bed, doing nothing, thinking as little as possible. On top of that came the feeding. Patients were overfed deliberately, a rich diet heavy in milk, cream, butter and red meat, designed to make them gain weight, because thinness was associated with the nervous, depleted state they were trying to reverse. Massage and mild electrical stimulation of the muscles were added, largely to compensate for the fact that lying motionless for 2 months does devastating things to the body. And that's not me editorializing. Mitchell himself understood that immobilizing someone weakened their circulation, their digestion, and their strength. He knew the rest itself was doing harm and built in the massage to counteract it. Now, on the surface, this could sound almost benign. Overbearing, sure, but well-meaning. And for some patients, genuinely exhausted, malnourished people, a period of care, food and calm did help. It sometimes kept people fed, stable, even out of an asylum. I want to be fair about that. But think about what this treatment actually does to the wrong patient. Take someone who is anxious or depressed or trapped in a life that's crushing them and remove every single thing that gives them relief, meaning, or connection. No books, no work, no friends, no creative outlet, no conversation. Nothing but a bed, a ceiling, and the inside of their own head for 2 months. For a person in mental distress, that's not rest. That's sensory and social starvation. It's solitary confinement with a nicer bedspread. And instead of soothing an anxious mind, it can wind it tighter and tighter with nothing to discharge against. Which is exactly what happened to one particular patient. A writer. And what she did in response turned the Rest Cure's reputation inside out, and left us the single most damning piece of evidence about what this cure really did to people. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and in 1887 she was sent to Silas Weir Mitchell. She had been suffering from what we would very likely recognize today as severe depression, possibly postpartum depression after the birth of her daughter. She was exhausted, despairing, unable to function. So she went to the most famous nerve doctor in the country, and he prescribed his signature treatment. The rest, cure. She endured it. The isolation, the enforced idleness, the ban on the intellectual and creative work that was the center of her entire being, because Gilman was a writer, a thinker, an activist. And then, according to her own account, Mitchell sent her home with a prescription that reads like something out of a nightmare. She recalled being told to live as domestic a life as possible, to keep her child with her at all times, to have only a couple of hours of intellectual activity a day, and to never touch a pen, brush, or pencil again as long as she lived. For a writer, that is not a treatment. That is an amputation. Gilman tried to follow it, and by her own description, she was driven to the brink. She came, in her words, perilously close to losing her mind completely. She described crawling into closets, hiding under beds, reduced to a kind of mental collapse by the very cure that was supposed to save her. And then, she did something extraordinary. She rejected it. She threw out Mitchell's advice, went back to work, back to writing, back to a full intellectual life, and she recovered. Not completely, not simply, but enough to reclaim herself. And then, she picked up the pen he told her never to touch, and she used it as a weapon. In 1892, she published a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper. It's told from the perspective of a woman confined to a room by her physician husband for a rest cure, forbidden from working or writing, left alone with nothing but the hideous yellow wallpaper on the walls. And across the story, we watch her mind slowly unravel, until she becomes convinced there's a woman trapped inside the wallpaper's pattern, a woman trying to get out. It's one of the most chilling depictions of a mind coming apart ever written, and it's essentially a first-hand report of what enforced isolation does to a person. Gilman said outright that she wrote it about her own experience, and that she sent a copy to Mitchell himself. She wanted him to see what his cure did from the inside. She later claimed she'd heard he changed his methods after reading it, though that's uncertain, and historians debate whether he ever really did. But the story survived. It outlived Mitchell's reputation, and today far more people know the rest cure through Gilman's horror story than through any medical text. She turned her own suffering into the most effective indictment of the treatment that ever existed. The patient the system tried to silence became the reason we remember what it did. She wasn't alone in that either. Around the same period, Virginia Woolf, who would later undergo rest cure treatment herself, also documented the suffocating effects of enforced idleness on a creative mind, lending further literary weight to what Gilman had already put into words. Different women, same system, same damage. And her case wasn't unique. She was simply the one who wrote it down. So what happened to all the women who didn't? Gilman got out because she had the will, the resources, and the sheer stubbornness to walk away. Many didn't. For the women who didn't respond to the rest cure, who got worse instead of better, who resisted, who couldn't be fixed, and sent back to domestic life, there was a next step, and it was darker. Some were funneled onward into asylums. And a 19th century asylum was not a place of gentle recovery. Committal could happen with disturbing ease, sometimes on little more than the say-so of a husband and a doctor. Once inside, people could remain for years. The same distress that started as nerves and became a rest cure could end with a person institutionalized, out of sight, and largely powerless to get themselves out. This is part of why figures like Elizabeth Packard matter so much to this history. Packard was an Illinois woman committed to an asylum in 1860 by her husband, legally, with almost no recourse, and who spent years fighting to expose how easily that system could be weaponized against women. After her release, she became a tireless activist for asylum reform, and her case is a stark illustration of exactly where the rest cure pipeline could ultimately lead. So let's total up the honest ledger here, because it's grim enough without exaggeration. The rest cure directly harmed an unknown number of people by stripping them of everything that sustained them. It was part of a system that pathologized women's ambition, independence, and unhappiness. And it fed into an asylum network that could swallow people whole. Did it literally kill people? In individual cases, through the despair it deepened, the breakdowns it triggered, the institutional pipelines it led to, real lives were genuinely destroyed, and some were surely lost. But there was no mass slaughter of introverts. That part is invented. What's real is arguably more unsettling, because it wasn't a conspiracy or a horror movie villain. It was respectable medicine. Well-dressed doctors with good reputations, genuinely believing they were helping, administering a treatment that told women the solution to their suffering was to become smaller, quieter, and more obedient. The cruelty wasn't in the intent. It was in the assumptions, baked so deep that nobody in charge could see them. And notice what the treatment was really aimed at. Remember, Mitchell prescribed the opposite to his male patients. Nervous, exhausted men were often prescribed what became known as the West Cure, told to go west, to travel, ride, hunt, take on rugged physical adventure, to re-engage with the world. Women were told to lie down, shut up, and stay home. The same illness, two opposite cures, which tells you the medicine wasn't really treating a nervous system at all. It was enforcing a role. Men were cured back into activity and power. Women were cured back into stillness and submission. So when you see that viral title, The Insane Treatment That Killed Introverts, now you know the truth underneath it. They weren't targeting introverts. They were targeting people, mostly women, whose minds and desires didn't fit the mold, and calling that mismatch a disease. The rest cure wasn't insane, and that's the scariest part. It was perfectly logical, given what that world believed people were for. The real horror was never a mad scientist. It was a society that decided certain kinds of suffering and certain kinds of people were problems to be quietly managed into silence. And the fact that we remember it at all is because a few of them, like Gilman, refused to stay quiet.